Hi, I'm Eileen Lousteau from iShares, and I head up our client education department. And we wanted to continue our conversation with Chuck, representing questions that have come in from advisors and other financial professionals. So we have more questions and more to talk to you about, Chuck. Is
Not
that
a problem.
okay?
Oh, sure. That's great.
That's great. Well, the number one question that we've gotten from a lot of our financial professionals who take our courses is, how can we really make this more actionable? We've talked a lot at the high level about the principles, but what would you say are your 3 steps or 4 steps? What can we really put into action?
Well, one of the things that really comes out in most of the presentations that I make is that there are 3 things that are really key components, key parts of what happens when a person crosses the ethical boundary to perhaps a lack of ethics or unethics or whatever the appropriate word might be. And those are need, opportunity, and rationalization. When you breach something that is right to something that is wrong, most of the time those 3 things will come into play. And let me give you a personal example. But the last one is rationalization, which is, how does a person who is ethical, has integrity, understands honesty, how does that person breach that and convince themselves that doing something wrong is something right? And that's when you begin to rationalize it. And in my case, I'll go into rationalization because it really, to some extent, plays in the example. I knew I had a need for money. I knew that taking money was wrong. No question about that. That's theft. Well, I wasn't going to be a thief, but I rationalized that I could borrow the money. So I sat down at my computer and I typed up a note, and the note was to the client from me saying that in fact I was borrowing the money, that I was going to repay the money, and I would repay it with interest, creating the illusion that theft was in reality borrowing, and borrowing is okay, theft is wrong. So I met the need through the opportunity and rationalized my behavior.
Right, and it really wasn't, or I'm not trying to tell your story for you, but it wasn't until you can't repay it, then all of a sudden you're sort of stuck,
Oh,
right?
that's true, that's true. In fact, the reality is when you breach that ethical behavior and you create the illusion, and it was a grand illusion, but when you create the illusion, you get so caught up in the illusion that you forget what reality is. Until reality happens. When that card is pulled out of that deck and the deck collapses, then all of a sudden you're back into reality. Wait a minute, I really was nothing more than a liar and a thief.
So I think from an actionable perspective, the idea of need, opportunity, and rationalization is something that we can all sort of use as a framework. What about in terms of personality traits? Have you ever maybe tried to organize looking at ethical behavior, ethical actions based on somebody's personality trait?
You know, that's interesting because that question has come up many, many times. And if you go back and you really start to look at different breaches, especially from a financial services perspective, whether there has been tax evasion, embezzlement, out-and-out theft, cyber types of crimes, and you start to look at it, the studies thus far that have been done, not that there have been that many, don't seem to correlate with a particular type of behavior on the Myers-Briggs is going to lead you to, and I'm using Myers-Briggs just as an example because there's so many, but is going to lead you to this is the type of person that will create the fraud or the ethical lapse. More times than not, what happens is the question of unusual circumstances or temptation. And that can come in so many different ways. It could be the most honest person who is the church-going person and so forth, who finds that there is a medical need and the need is so great that the temptation causes the change of behavior.
Mr. Gallagher? It's tight. Let's do it.
Every choice has a consequence. On October 2nd, 1995, I took 23 steps. That's the distance it took me to walk to here and back. As I took those steps, I thought about my wife. I thought about my two children, Rob and Alex. I thought about my career. I thought about the home that I lived in. I thought about everything that defined who I was. As I took those 23 steps, I was Chuck Gallagher. I was a somebody in the community that I lived in. On the 23rd step, I reached out my hand, opened the door, and stepped into federal prison. I became 11-6-42-058. What most of you in this room would define as a nobody. Every choice has a consequence.
And speaking of consequences, we've actually got a lot of questions here where people want to hear about you. So people are curious, you know, what was the consequence for you? I mean, what was it like being in jail, and what was that prison sentence like?
Well,
how long were you in jail?
Well,
Give us all the, people want all the detail. This
inquiring
is like
minds want to know.
The
Okay.
Chuck Gallagher story.
Right. Well, the reality of it was, first, when that card was pulled, so when you ask yourself the question, you know, where is the ethical boundary and the ethical line? Ethics may be one thing, legal is another. Sometimes those two mesh perfectly, and sometimes they seem oddly apart. But every choice has a consequence. If I'm starting to rationalize, well, you know, but I'm doing it because, when that because word hits, that's probably the time you need to step back and say, you know what? This isn't going in the right direction.
I think those are excellent examples, and really the way you just put it, it's either ethical or unethical. Don't even think about impact, and because the second you think about impact, you're rationalizing.
Right, that's correct. When you think about impact, you begin to rationalize the behavior, and over time, then the impact starts to mentally change. One of the things that I will commend you on is, because iShares is going through this process of creating this material, the reality is, if you make someone conscious of something that otherwise would be unconscious, need, opportunity, and rationalization is unconscious to most of society.
Right.
But if you make it conscious, then the reality comes down to, at least they are aware. And awareness might mean behavior would change.
That's great. And that's our ultimate hope for this presentation. So Chuck, I think you've been immensely helpful in putting some structure around ethics and helping our financial professionals see how it can be actionable, and also really defining that there is no gray line. It's either ethical or unethical. And I just want to say, Chuck, thank you once again for all of your wisdom and insights.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.